When season 3 of White Lotus debuted featuring yet another wealthy white family, audiences, especially gay audiences, were quick to pick up on some, let's say, interesting undertones between the two brothers.
Warning, there are spoiler alerts ahead.
Over the course of the season, we've seen a build-up from some pretty choice camera angles all the way to some pretty frank dialogue between the brothers, and more recently, a literal kiss. And just from that kiss, gay Twitter was gagged and divided. And that was before the even bigger reveal that just happened in episode 6, where we found out that it was maybe just a bit more than a kiss. Go back over a decade now to HBO's own Game of Thrones, and you might recall a very similar plotline between a brother and sister. Audiences at the time were shocked and disgusted, but there wasn't this sense of moral outrage, and there wasn't this sense that the straights had gone too far this time. Over a decade later, in White Lotus, we've seen a playful kiss alone cause outrage. So when episode 6 dropped and we found out there was more, it made things about this discourse even more juicy and even more interesting for me. That's why I just had to make a video. It should be made clear in both instances, both in Game of Thrones and here, the storyline was fictional. I'm not advocating for incest in any way. I'm not saying that any of this behavior in real life should be normalized. I think that fiction deserves some special treatment to be able to talk about things that we don't really like to talk about. Because frankly, some of the topics do happen in real life and they make us very uncomfortable. But I think it's really important that we engage critically with that discomfort and we think about the ways that these issues actually might have a real world implication. I go further to say that audiences have been primed for decades now to view an older brother harassing his younger sister as just boys being boys. This is a view that Victoria Ratliff espouses herself when she basically brushes her own torture that she felt under the hands of her brother as just kind of something to laugh about and get over now that she's an adult. So in this sense, we see straight abuse normalized, but gay abuse, I'd argue, is always pathologized. In interviews, Mike White has stated that he wants to make queer stories transgressive again, and he's not concerned about showing good queer representation. This is in such contrast to the trend over the past decade from things like Love, Simon and Heartstopper, which seem almost hyper-focused on making good gays happen. And there's nothing inherently wrong with showing good gays, because I think we deserve wholesome media too. But just like the straights can enjoy wholesome characters and also have characters that are conflicted and honestly anti-heroes, why can't gays have the same? Why are we always held to this moral standard that isn't applied to straight people? And frankly, if you look around, all this wholesome media hasn't really proven to be a successful strategy for making our political lives better. If anything, we're under constant attack from politicians for being disgusting or predators, and that's with all this good representation. I think in a way, this whole plotline is a big middle finger to the idea that we have to be good. So is this taboo exploration of adolescent queer sexuality the antivenom to all this good representation and mainstream audiences' expectation that gays need to be good? Well, I'd argue that the pearl clutching in some ways is the point. Without minimizing the experiences of real-world abuse survivors, I think it's important that we can look at this topic with a critical lens and see beyond just the shocking. I think the moral outrage here misses the point and holds queer stories to an unfair standard that we don't hold heterosexual stories to. A Time magazine article titled "Let's Talk About the Incest on the White Lotus," with help from some experts by Eliana Dockertman, published recently, features an interview with Tanya Rowell and Sonia Kaur, two consultants at the Rape, Abuse, and Incest National Network, RAIN, to discuss this topic with sensitivity as it intersects with topics of real-world abuse. In that article, the experts raised some great points about how Saxon repeatedly made sexualized comments about his sister Piper in a way that received no meaningful response from his parents. I can't help but wonder why a fictional kiss in a story in 2025 has caused so much moral hand-wringing. And I can't help but wonder if the reaction would be the same if it was a heterosexual storyline. But I don't think we have to be so literal here. All of this doesn't even begin to get at the idea of Saxon as more than just a character, but as a symbol for white masculine identity and this golden norm in our society. And this golden norm, a masculine, fit, successful, athletic man, is something that gay men in particular have a very complicated, and queer men in particular have a very complicated relationship with. But beyond that, growing up queer, especially as a queer male, is defined in a lot of ways by being attracted to that which is dangerous to you, namely masculinity. In a lot of ways, it was a very defining adolescent experience for myself even, and I know a lot of queer men feel the same way. Just think about how aggressively Saxon leans into so many tropes of the manosphere. He loves working, and he loves working out, and his whole life is about gains, both financial and physical. Throughout the season, we've seen him embody hyper-masculine tropes, from incessantly making protein shakes and chugging them at any instant, to encouraging his little brother to treat women as a sexual conquest, as a form of rite of passage of sorts. Most of Saxon's dialogue with his female family members in particular, especially Piper, have involved just belittling their points of view. A few episodes back, he even went so far as to shame Piper for allegedly being a virgin and making her feel visibly and clearly uncomfortable. Saxon has repeatedly violated the boundaries of his siblings. To me, it feels like Mike White has made choices to make Saxon hyper-masculine, to the point that he's not really even a character. He's more of a symbol. And he's a symbol for masculinity, yes, but a very particular, dare I say, toxic form of masculinity. As an extremely privileged, attractive, athletic, and masculine young man, Saxon embodies a sort of golden norm in Western society. That's why his reaction to breaking that norm, breaking that archetype, is so visceral. After a taboo threesome involving his brother, one of the first things we see him do is act in disgust, and then he literally vomits. Sure, he had a long night, but I think the choice to show him vomiting was to express a specific type of reaction, this visceral disgust that he, as a straight masculine man, is supposed to have to the idea of that sanctity and that privileged position being somehow violated or undermined by, in this case, a very pernicious queer threat. In fact, his initial reaction after Chloe and Chelsea revealed to him the full extent of what actually happened that night is to literally go back to the hotel room and chug a protein shake. It doesn't get more symbolic than that. If your masculinity's been threatened by a threesome with your brother, just keep chugging that culturally prescribed masculinity. It'll do wonders. Interestingly to me, Saxon is normally the perpetrator of violence towards his siblings and to others around him. He's had a very laissez-faire attitude at best about very real-world issues that women face regarding sexual assault, and that many men face regarding sexual assault as well. Saxon repeatedly asserts his dominance in the family structure as a way of feeling secure about his masculinity. So when Lochlan undermines that security, it kind of throws his whole world upside down. In fact, if you might recall, Saxon wasn't fully consensual this whole time. I mean, he was very much peer pressured into taking the pill, and Chloe and Chelsea in particular seem to, in my opinion, exhibit a lot of pressuring behavior. Lochlan's role of how things escalated so quickly is a little bit hazy, and I think it's hazy intentionally. It's not clear to me whether Saxon and Lochlan's interactions were fully mutual, or if Lochlan was pushing things beyond Saxon's boundaries. I think one theory I have is that we've seen Lochlan exhibit many, I guess, closeted queer tropes throughout this season, from being kind of told that he's a little bit too effeminate to like awkwardly laughing at homophobic and transphobic jokes around his brother. It feels like he might be like a closeted sort of kid. It's not entirely out of the realm of possibility that in a really weird way, Lochlan might have taken advantage of this like opportunity of sorts. I don't necessarily think that Lochlan has a crush on Saxon, but I think that Saxon represents an idea of masculinity, which is something that Lochlan is finding himself attracted to. So, does Lochlan's sexuality actually make it different? We aren't yet sure whether or not Lochlan is gay or queer or bi or questioning or any of those things, but I think it seems clear to me at this point that the show is hinting that he might be. And I think the fact that we're just not sure is opening up a big can of worms. One read of the situation is that if Lochlan were straight, this would just be kind of a funny, bro-y incident that happened one night when they were way too drunk in Thailand. But if Lochlan were gay or queer and might have enjoyed it, then we're getting into some very taboo territory. But I don't think that our reaction as an audience should be colored by the same-sex nature of the attraction. And I think that's what Mike White is trying to parse out here. If you recall at the beginning of episode 6, we saw Saxon basically have one vision of what happened. And in that vision, he was the one with his hand underneath the sheets. And that was a story that he told himself. It was something that he could kind of rationalize and sweep under the rug. That's why the scene with Chloe and Chelsea at the pool was so shocking, is because it completely took away his ability to pretend that that's all that happened. And the possibility that it was Lochlan's hand under the sheet makes things, let's just say, a lot more complicated for everyone involved. But I'd argue that we shouldn't treat Lochlan here as a villain yet without additional information. I mean, remember, Saxon has clearly shown no regard for boundaries of his siblings so far this season. While one wrong doesn't make a right, if we're not as critical of Saxon as we are of Lochlan potentially crossing a boundary, to me that indicates a double standard. And you might be saying, well, one was physical and one was just verbal. But to me, I feel if Saxon is willing to just completely bully and cross his sister's boundaries in such a nonchalant way and not even really make any form of apology about it, it's not that hard of a leap to think that he wouldn't really care if a physical boundary was crossed. It only seems to be a problem because it happened to him. And back to Game of Thrones, I think if we weren't saying that the Lannisters were giving the straights a bad name, why am I seeing discourse that White Lotus, and specifically the plotline with Saxon and Lochlan, is giving gay people a bad name? But I think that Mike White knew that we would hold this story to a different standard. And I think that's precisely the point. Saxon seems to think that if they were just two brothers who were too drunk to know what was going on, then that makes it okay. That is to say that if both brothers were heterosexual, everything's more or less fine. But if one brother was actually not heterosexual, then that makes it something weird, sinister, and something that honestly would be really difficult to get past. Basically, the fear here is that Lochlan isn't straight, or even worse, Saxon might not be 100% straight. That's the vomiting. That's the need to chug that protein shake. The point of the plotline between Saxon and Lochlan is to make us examine masculinity and to make us examine our double standards and our differing standards of queer relationships and queer sexuality versus heterosexual relationships and heterosexual sexuality. To me, it's about masculinity, culture, and the way that we view different things differently depending on the sexuality of characters. And at the heart, it's about our fear of same-sex desire. But by making that same-sex desire come about in such a hazy and kind of unclear way, I think it really points to the fact that we're meant to examine this at multiple different angles and to examine the implications of different truths and different realities and how that might impact the way we perceive the same event. As many have said, good media holds a mirror to our world and forces us to examine it and criticize it. I don't think Mike White is showing the plotline to normalize abuse. Rather, I think that this plotline is for us to think critically about how we revere straight masculinity and view queerness as a threat to the sanctity of the patriarchal, heteronormative family structure and to its presumed infallibility. The episode opens with one version of events, notably a more palatable one, and it ends with a more transgressive version of events, one that clearly threatens the status quo. To me, showing multiple versions of the same night clearly indicates that the show wants us to think about the differences in meaning that both Saxon and we as an audience ascribe to differing events. As Saxon is quick to assure himself, it was just a joke, which is initially what we got with the portrayal of events where Saxon was the one with his hand underneath the sheet. But when Lochlan's hand was underneath there, we couldn't just see it as a joke. A line was crossed. Drunken debauchery turned into something more sinister, simply by who was doing what action underneath the sheet. It crosses from unconventional but heterosexual to taboo and homosexual, and it crosses from funny to fearful, downright horrifying, really, if you look at the reaction that Saxon had on his face. I'll be very curious to see how Lochlan reacts in the next episode. I'd be curious to know if this is a queer awakening or something that forces him even further into the closet out of shame of what had happened. There's so many ways we could go from this point, and I can't wait to see what route the show ends up taking. But I'm not going to join the chorus of people saying that this is bad representation and that it shouldn't be made, because I think we need to have representation that is bad. I think we as queer people have been robbed of the ability to express ourselves artistically in this era of feeling the need to constantly be on our best behavior for fear of political persecution. Frankly, I'm with you, Mike. Let's make queer representation transgressive again.